With all the stuff going on with Syria and Russia and how we're all kind of holding our breath for World War III, and then you hear about Trump with the 3 and 4D chess and whatnot, and what I think tremendous restraint from Putin. You have talk about Putin and Trump behind the scenes, talking about things while what we see is all window dressing and all this stuff going on. And what I like to do when I talk about these things is get a hold of Jim Jatras. He's a foreign policy expert, government and media relations person, former U.S. diplomat and GOP Senate foreign advisor on policy. He has been on the show before. I appreciate him coming on because he's one of the guys with eyes, ears, feet, and knowledge on the ground, very informed in that area, and we can talk about these issues and not have to guess and come up with all kinds of read into things and rumors and whatnot. So let me get Jim on here. And welcome back to Feet to the Fire, James.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
So what do you think about what's going on with all this? I mean, I'm thinking like the Cold War was over. We're all, it's all wonderful and this and that. Trump is going to make good relations with Putin and Russia. He gets elected, and we have this whole phony conspiracy, Russian conspiracy, and all this stuff. And now it's like worse than ever. At least it seems like it. What do you think?
Oh, it is definitely worse than ever. There's no question about it. I mean, for the last few years, people have been ruminating, are we in a new Cold War again or not? Is one inevitable? And I'm thinking, what are you kidding? Of course we're in a new Cold War. We have been in a new Cold War for sometimes several years, if not 10 years. The only difference is that this one is much more dangerous than the first one, that the mutual respect that existed between Moscow and Washington during the first Cold War doesn't exist anymore, that we've seen the demonization of Russia and specifically of Vladimir Putin in a way we never saw. A demonization of the Soviet Union when the communists were in control. Even Stalin was not made out to be such a bad guy as Vladimir Putin is, and you wonder what is behind all of this and where it is all going. And I think that's what really gave a queasy feeling to a lot of people on Friday the 13th this past week, when President Trump launched the attack against Syria, and we didn't really know it was coming. There were so many people here beating the drums, not only for a counterstrike against Syria based on this claim of chemical weapons use, but also to really teach the Russians a lesson as well. We need to bloody those guys to show them who's boss. And even though their chief of staff, General Valery Gerasimov, had promised that there would be countermeasures against not only incoming missiles, but to destroy the platforms that sent them. That it was almost an atmosphere of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis again. And when we heard the missiles were flying, I think some of us were wondering, oh boy, this is going to get big and nasty. Luckily, it didn't. So I think that we have a very complex picture here. What really happened in Syria over the last few weeks? What was the significance of that strike that took place? Why did President Trump do it? What is the role of other parties? As we know, the Russians have specifically accused the British of being behind what they consider to be a staged provocation, not even a false flag chemical attack committed by the terrorists, as we've seen in the past in Syria, but a whole cloth charade put on as a show for the Western media to gull Western governments, or maybe as a hand in glove to Western governments that knew that a provocation was coming. And what does this mean going forward in the big picture strategically for U.S. foreign policy, for the promises that Trump made in 2016? And even if this episode did not result in the big one, what are the prospects that something else will happen further down the line?
Well, that is why I have you on, because I would like to answer all those questions. But as far as this whole provocation, I don't have inside information. I'm not there. But when someone says that President Assad ordered the gassing of his people again, right after President Trump said he wants to leave Syria, I mean, it sounds to be inane that someone would believe that actually happened, or that he is that dumb as to do something like that. What do you think about the this whole deal about this, quote, provocation?
Yeah, I think Rand Paul's the one who made the observation that if he did do it, Assad must be the dumbest dictator in history, because it would have precisely the result of galvanizing all the world opposition against him at a time when he's winning. Why would he do that? Now, that itself is not dispositive proof, but it's a good working hypothesis moving forward. And you add to that the fact that with the Idlib strike in April of last year, where Trump first proved that he was president, according to Fareed Zakaria, by launching that strike. Even General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said about 2 months ago that even now we don't have proof that the Syrian government was actually behind that strike. And there's a lot of reason to think that that was actually the terrorists who staged it as a false flag attack. So you really do wonder on what basis are these people making these decisions? Look, the thought that occurs to me as well is the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, had their people on the ground already proceeding to the site at the end of last week. On Friday of last week, they should have arrived Saturday or Sunday, the 14th or 15th. Even if Western governments were utterly convinced Assad was behind this, what would be the harm of waiting a day? Or what changes in a few days to allow the team to go there and do its work? Let's remember that at all the previous sites of claimed use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government, the site was under the control of so-called rebel forces, which really means these jihadist terrorists. And in the case of Duma, for example, this most recent one, how often do you hear on the mainstream media who the so-called rebels are? It's a group called Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam. They're an offshoot of al-Qaeda. They've been terrorizing the people of this town for almost the entire duration of this war so far that's been going on over 7 years. You do see whenever these areas are liberated by the Syrian government, people going back in droves. The churches especially reopening that were not able to operate during the time the terrorists were running, controlling those areas. So here we have an area that's now been removed from terrorist control. The government controls it again. We now have access to it. Why not wait till the OPCW can go in? So what do we get instead? We get the bombing strikes that disrupt everything, and then we have these, what I think are more phony stories, saying the Syrians and Russians are obstructing access to the site. Well, how can that be? Robert Fisk from The Independent got there. Pearson Sharp from One America News got there. Why can't the OPCW go in there? Oh, well, we hear that the head of the team is an Australian, and he's making the final call. Well, knowing how closely the Five Eyes intelligence agencies work, and those are the intelligence agencies of the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the five Anglophone countries, I can't rule out that the Australian making this call is really got other motives than finding out what really happened there at Duma. So, these questions always come up, and you say, why, what was the haste? Why did we have to do this? And then you get back to what I think are the larger political reasons here is that we keep hearing from the Trump administration, from President Trump personally, our only interest in Syria is defeating ISIS. Well, ISIS is defeated. The only reason ISIS is still left around at all is because we keep weighing in not against ISIS, but against the Syrian government, which allows breathing room for ISIS to continue and maybe to try to start to grow again. It's evidently considered some kind of a strategic asset by somebody. The real purpose clearly has nothing to do with ISIS. It has to do with countering the Iranians and the Russians. And for that purpose, Syria is just a theater. It's a football. We've demanded Assad must go. We want the terrorists to take over instead of Assad. And by golly, by hook or by crook, we're going to achieve that outcome.
Yeah, it sure looks like that. I mean, I was very, very unhappy because when I voted for President Trump.
Well, I voted for Bush too, and I regretted that too. I don't regret voting for Trump. I certainly regret voting for Bush.
One of the big three things that I wanted to do was because of this. He was going to, work with Russia and get out of Syria. That was a big thing. I mean, I wanted Obamacare gone. I like the idea of the tax cut / working for bringing business back and all that. Those are great. I was really disappointed in this. And then, so what do you think about the people who are saying, for example, like the first time he struck there, for this so-called same reason, that he was doing this to avoid, let's say, the deep state military hawks. And so he did this, gave the Russians and Syrians plenty of notice, kind of bombed out an empty building and said, we show them. And that shut off. Do you think this might be, in this case, something?
I think it is. And any way you interpret it, it doesn't speak well about his situation. Look, as far as Russia goes, yes. I wrote a piece a few months ago called "It's the Russia Stupid," which indicates, I think spells out why this whole thing with the Russian collusion and Mueller, all of these things, and Trump has even alluded to this in his tweet. In fact, just on the eve of the strike, saying something about the whole Mueller probe is a put-up job, is to prevent that very thing, is that the deep state, and that includes not only the American, but the sister agencies in places like the United Kingdom, do not want a Western rapprochement with Moscow. That their bread and butter on it, their entire view of the world rests on this perpetual enmity with Moscow and constantly encroaching on their strategic space, and ultimately to achieve regime change in Moscow and if it is possible, even to break Russia up into multiple parts, the way Zbigniew Brzezinski suggested should be the goal of American policy. I think the Russians understand that. And I think rather belatedly and reluctantly, you keep hearing from them, our American partners, our Western partners, they still keep trying to engage us in what they think would be a cooperative relationship with regard to mutual interests, specifically that we should have a working relationship in fighting Islamic Jihad terror. And instead, what they see is our constantly using such terrorists as a kind of a foot soldier for our various geostrategic goals, as we did in the Balkans in the 1990s, as we did in Libya, and now we're doing in Syria. So I think there are an awful lot of people, not just in Washington, but in some of our allied capitals, who really don't want this to happen. That also relates, by the way, to what is interesting to me, not only the British fingerprints on the Duma provocation, but also this Skripal poisoning in the United Kingdom a while back that also has the connections to Christopher Steele, the guy behind the so-called dirty dossier. In fact, I had another piece written several months ago. It said, "Is the Steele dossier full of Russian dirt or British dirt?" I mean, Christopher Steele's not a Russian agent. He's MI6. He's British. Andrew Wood, the retired diplomat who gave the dossier to David Kramer, an associate of Senator John McCain, for its dissemination around Washington, is obviously not Russian either. He's also British. You really do wonder what exactly the links are between the James Clappers and the John Brennans and James Comeys and the other people within our establishment and their counterpart agencies abroad who have the freedom to operate in the United States with somewhat less scrutiny than they themselves can. For example, months ago, I suggested, and also Judge Andrew Napolitano suggested, that the Trump campaign was likely spied on by GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters in the United Kingdom, which is the counterpart of the NSA. Why? Because it's common knowledge in the intelligence community that the Five Eyes agencies wash each other's hands. American agencies aren't supposed to spy on Americans. British agencies aren't supposed to spy on Britons. Australian agencies aren't supposed to spy on Australians. But they can spy on each other's citizens and then share the data with their sister agency. It's a great way to get around some of the domestic restrictions on violation of civil rights.
Yeah, it's very tricky and very unpleasant that they can do this type of thing. So as far as Syria goes, I mean, I'm amazed at the restraint in the Russians in Syria, and I'm amazed at the steadfastness of the Syrian president. I'm looking at this. I'm trying to come up with a scenario similar. Like, so I read an article where someone said, "We're lucky the Russians didn't bomb us in response to Waco," type of a thing. And I'm wondering, is how come? Another article I saw, where an interview is where they had a question asked to the former CIA director and said, "Have we ever rigged elections abroad?" And he kind of smiled and said, "Well, we did it for the right reasons, though." I can't fathom this. We can do these things because it's okay, because it's us, but they can't do it because they're doing bad. And I don't get how that contradiction can still be happening in 2018.
Well, that's really what gets us back to the really big picture here, if you will, of which Syria is essentially just a theater. And that is that with the end of the first Cold War, with the demise of the Soviet Union, that the United States emerged as the sole superpower, the unipolar moment, the global hegemon. As Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan said, that America should engage upon a course of benevolent global hegemony that should last forever. And that if Russia and China don't like that, well, we should take their displeasure as a compliment. And I think what we're seeing here is that we've sort of come to the end of the rope there, that after 2.5 decades of wasting trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, God knows how many hundreds of thousands or millions of lives of people in other countries, and having only wreckage and chaos to show for it, which some people, by the way, suggest is the real goal of the policy, that I think we do have a reaction, especially among the American people, saying, enough of this. We don't want this anymore. We don't need to be the global empire. And what that necessarily means, however, is that we need to achieve some kind of balanced understanding with the other significant powers in the world. That's preeminently means Russia and China. There are others as well that need to be taken into account, the Europeans, India, but at least we have to start talking to the Russians and the Chinese and come up with some kind of rules of the road about where we have vital interests, where they have vital interests, and how we prevent those vital interests from clashing. This is classic statecraft. This is what kept the broad peace throughout the 19th century, from the Napoleonic Wars till the Guns of August in 1914, where the great powers was called the Concert of Europe, where they would understand where each other's red lines were and took pains not to cross them. We don't do that. Our view is there are no such things as sphere of influence, which essentially means there's only one sphere of influence, the American one, and it's global. Well, how do the American people benefit from that? Well, we don't. But what it means is we have anointed ourselves with a kind of a super sovereign legitimacy that outweighs the legitimacy of every other country on every other square foot of territory in the world, even within their own countries, where we get to be the judge of what is right, what is legal, what is moral, and then engage in behavior which is absolutely illegal and, in my opinion, immoral. For example, the strike on Syria. There's absolutely no legal justification for it, even if you thought that Assad had used chemical weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention is not self-authorizing or self-activating or self-imposing. It doesn't grant the United States or any other country on its own say-so to go try to enforce it if they think it's been violated. There are only two sources of legitimacy for the use of military force under the UN Charter, which is a treaty, which is legally binding. One is individual or collective self-defense. If a country or group of countries thinks they're have been attacked or think that an attack is imminent, they may take the steps to defend themselves. Well, obviously, we weren't doing that in Syria. The other one is if the Security Council authorizes action under Chapter 7 to maintain international peace and security. Obviously, that didn't happen either. So we were behaving illegally. How often have you heard that discussed on any American program? Gee, but what is our legal authority for undertaking this step? Does anybody know? Does anybody care? No, it really doesn't matter, because we are preserving this hegemonic moment. And I think that, unfortunately, is what most of the professional establishment here in Washington is dedicated to doing, partly, of course, because they all profit personally from such a course and have been. They built their entire careers on this enterprise. And what they don't want to see is what I think we need to do, which is to take a step back, reach an understanding with Moscow and Beijing about where our essential interests are, where theirs are. And if that sounds like we're kind of dividing up the globe among ourselves, I think it does to some extent, but more of a negative sense. We will stay out of these areas. They will stay out of these other areas. We come up with a way to avoid collisions. I think that's just the prudent thing to do. But unfortunately, we're not ready to do it. And the longer we keep pushing to say, we have decreed that the Syrian government must go. If you try to interrupt that, you're crossing us. You're going to pay for it. then this risk of a new Cuban Missile Crisis, a new confrontation that could escalate out of control, will never go away. And at one point, somebody may screw up badly and something very, very bad happens.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I mean, I think that, again, Russia and Putin are making tremendous restraints. I mean, do you think that I'm getting, maybe, I don't know if it's desperate or hopeful, but do you think there might be some back channel communication between Putin and Trump that, hey, Trump is saying, hey, look, I'm dealing with this deep state here. You know how it is over there, dealing with the former Soviets and all that, and you know, I'm going to do some things, and we'll try to work out something, make it all flashy, and we don't want to start World War II. I mean, do you think something might like that be going on?
I'm sure there are many deep back channels, and that's reassuring to some extent. Look, I'm not a big fan of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State designate, but I'm somewhat relieved that he went to go see Kim Jong-un. I'd like to think people are talking behind the scenes and coming up with ways to step back from the brink of military action. I understand in the case of Syria, there are channels, what they call the deconfliction line of communication that they have in Syria. We claim we did not notify the Russians in advance about which targets we were going to hit, although there's some speculation that we didn't. We just let the French do it. That the Russians were notified we were going to hit. We made a point of not hitting Russian targets. Maybe people at the Pentagon took General Gerasimov seriously about his threat to retaliate if we did hit them, and cooler heads prevailed. It is somewhat worrisome to me that seemingly the most restrained and rational advisor around President Trump is somebody whose nickname is Mad Dog. That he's the moderate in this context, but at least he seems to have a professional military man's common sense that you don't want to push the button on killing a bunch of guys from another nuclear power when they've threatened to retaliate. That could turn out badly. I'm glad to see that has happened. As far as whether President Trump can talk to President Putin in the way that you suggested, given that those very deep state actors would be listening on the line and hearing every word, I somehow think he's not really free to say that. And this is where, look, I'm not going to engage in the speculation that all of us do from time to time, is that why isn't Trump following through on the things that he promised? Is it because he's a liar and a fraud and never intended to do that? I tend not to believe that, because why does he keep coming back to it? Why does he keep saying we want to get along with the Russians? Why does he keep saying I want to get out of Syria? He seems to be quite sincere about it, especially since every time he says that, it just brings another torrent of abuse on his head from the usual suspects. So I tend to think he's genuine about what he really wants to do, but I think he's kind of like Gulliver, tied down like by the Lilliputians by all of these cords that they've got him with, and he hasn't helped himself by pointing to all of the offices in administration. Nobody, as far as I can tell, nobody who actually agrees with candidate Trump of 2016. Instead, he appoints all these retreads from the Bush administration who want him to do in Iran what Bush did in Iraq. Maybe he thinks that, well, look, I'm the CEO, I'm the chairman of the board, I make the final decision. These people can do whatever they want, but I'll make the decision. You know, look, he's not hiring hotel managers here. He's not hiring accountants or lawyers. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. If he's being fed facts that are simply not true, or if he's being deprived of essential facts in an area where he cannot possibly have the detailed expertise, he's going to be presented with a list of options that are not attractive or maybe not exhaustive of what his real possibilities are. Simply the final decision isn't really necessarily the key thing. Look, I wrote enough decision memos when I was working for the government where if you write the memo right, the boss can only choose one of the decision options you give him. You skew the whole thing to the preferred option. That's the way you write these memos. And I'm sure this is what President Trump is being presented with. Now, there were reports that he actually wanted to do something more robust, which is a word they love here in Washington. And it was Mattis who insisted on something less destructive than what President Trump might have preferred. There's also a report, again, I don't know if it's true, that Mattis wanted Congress to vote on this first, and that Trump didn't insisted on moving forward anyway. So maybe he's just seeking political cover. Maybe he's looking for the praise from the people who are usually throwing insults at him, I really don't know. But I'm not particularly optimistic about where this is going.
No, I would have to agree. I still have my Trump banner up in my garage. You know, to the unpleasant to my neighbor doesn't like it, but I'm still there because I mean, let's face it. Who else would be could be in a position to do anything about it? So I mean, I'm there, but I was very disappointed in the bombing, and my only hope is that there is some battle going on behind the scenes that may resolve in a positive, and he's doing the best he can. I think he's doing the best he can anyway. I mean, I guess if I was in his shoes, I would be either been shot or thrown out or whatever, because you have to kind of bend with the with the reed.
Yeah.
But
I guess that's right. Look, he as I say, he's got a lot of the wrong people around him. You know, Nikki Haley has to be considered near the top of the list. She is clearly being groomed as some kind of a future presidential prospect. I have no doubt that if Trump is removed and Mike Pence becomes president, Nikki Haley would be put into the vice presidential slot. I think the establishment would be thrilled at having her there. And again, I think at that point it's all over, that the course for our country is determined. We will press forward with this global hegemonic enterprise until the inevitable crunch comes, and it will be very ugly. There's a writer, he's very controversial, but who has said that the difference between the Russians and the Americans, when he says the Americans, he means our establishment, not you and me and the rest of the American people, is that the Russians very much fear war, but they're prepared for it. The Americans do not fear war, and we're not prepared for it either.
I agree.
And that's a very, very dangerous combination, that when people think, and I think this is less true of the professional military and more true of the professional foreign policy, national security types, when they think they can insult and kick Russia around like Serbia or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that, they're engaging in a very, very dangerous fantasy. All we have to do is put a few more sanctions or really turn the screws a little more, and all the oligarchs will get together and overthrow Putin or whatever the regime change operation will be. I think they're really kidding themselves and not acting in best accord for our country's interest.
I'm wondering, do you think that there's some kind of, I mean, a lot of stuff's coming out now. You mentioned about One American News did a report on this. There wasn't gas. It was probably a staged event and all that. Do you think if it comes out definitively that this is not the case, that it was the attack was unwarranted, do you think that could be used as some type of impeachment, or will Trump be able to be covered by his that he was told this bad data? Information.
It's interesting. Of course, most of the people who would want to impeach him are the very ones that were urging him on to take this military step. And in fact, some of them even faulting him for not having done more. I don't think that would necessarily result in his impeachment. There's some speculation that the Russians are not releasing some of the evidence they have because they don't want to spoil, they don't want to hurt or damage any more than necessary the dialogue between the countries. Well, if that's true, I think that they're making a big mistake. Whatever they got, they need to throw it out there. I'm hoping in the short term, at least, it would have a damaging impact on Theresa May's government. And maybe she and Boris Johnson would be forced to step down. And again, I think there is a connection between what happened in Syria recently and what happened in Salisbury a few weeks ago as I think, a preparatory step to making this chemical weapons claim with regard to Syria. If you listen to the rhetoric coming from the British as well as some American officials, they're saying, and Russia has used chemical weapons. Not only have they facilitated their use in Syria, they've used chemical weapons on the territory of a NATO country. Again, no proof, no nothing, a lot of reason to doubt that story, but that's the kind of rhetoric we're hearing. And I think what it does is it convinces people on the other side, on the Russian side, that there is no salvaging this relationship, that if they become convinced that war is inevitable, that is a really scary thought. Vladimir Putin has been quoted as saying, from growing up on the mean streets of Leningrad, that if you know you're going to be in a fight and you can't avoid it, you choose the time and the place. I don't like that thought very much. But I don't know what those guys may decide is in their own best interest, perhaps erroneously, if they misread, or even worse, correctly read what the intentions are on our side, if they're that irresponsible and that dangerous. The other thing we need to keep in mind, too, is whatever happened or didn't happen over this past episode in Syria, we're not out of the woods yet with respect to that country. You've seen the reports now that we want to have a big deployment of so-called Arab allies. What a year ago they were talking about is an Arab NATO that was discussed at the time of Trump's maiden foreign policy trip to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and to NATO headquarters in Brussels. As though one NATO weren't problematic enough for us. And what this is clearly aimed at doing is to augment the deployment of the American forces in northeast Syria with all these additional Arab forces as kind of a bulwark against the Iranians. That somehow we're going to block the connection between Syria and Iraq. Now, maybe that would provide a cover for withdrawing American forces. I have to assume some Americans would remain there, if only as protection for the Saudis and the Emiratis and the other people that were deployed there, because I can just imagine that if there were a bunch of Saudis in eastern Syria, the Syrians would be just itching to have at them, because those are the people that have been the primary supporters of all these terrorists over the years, and they would just love to send some of those guys home in body bags.
I just shake my head at this, and I'm stunned by it, and I don't even know what to think. I'm just so happy that things haven't escalated. Do you think that? Well, actually, let me go to this article that you wrote. It's kind of an intriguing title. Did the West just lose World War III by forfeit? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is this: is that our ability to maintain this facade or this hegemonic dominance of global affairs really depends on our getting our way. In other words, if we say that Gaddafi must go, he goes. Because if he doesn't, he defies us and he stays there, well, then we've lost. We have to be in a position to enforce our will, no matter how ill-considered or immoral it might be. Well, we have sat up there on Mount Olympus for the last 7 years and decided Assad must go. There can be no future for Syria with Assad. Well, what if he's still there? What if he basically says, neener, neener, I'm still here, I'm not going anywhere? Well, that means we lost. That means our writ no longer applies to Syria, and that what the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah and Syria have said, their will outweighs our will and a specific spot on the planet, which means we don't rule it, they do. Once you do that, you cross the red line on that. What that means is we are no longer the omnipotent global hegemon we have claimed to be for the last 25 years. And that's why I analogized it to what was called the Great Standing on the Ugra River in 1480 between the forces of Moscow and the Mongol horde. The Mongols had to come back in to force the Russians to pay tribute and raise Moscow to the ground for their failure to pay. The Russians sent out a force to meet them. In the end, they didn't fight. They both turned around and went home because they were scared of the other. Well, if that's what we did in Syria, if our generals looked at the situation in Syria and said, well, the Russians say they're going to hit us back, we don't want to risk that. In a way, what we've done is we back down. And I'm not saying this to taunt or to ridicule anybody for having done the prudent thing, because I think that was the prudent thing to do. But we've gotten to the point where Moscow or Beijing or any other power on the planet can say, with respect to this piece of ground, our will prevail there and not yours. That means we've already started to back down from this ill-considered enterprise of global domination. I, in fact, think that's a victory for the American people and for the safety of the American people, but for this imperial vision that our establishment has been wedded to for the past quarter of a century, it is a defeat, and I hope that's what it turns out to be.
Yeah, I hope that it's an unwinding of this imperial type of force that's going on, because it's like I look at Syria, and the buildings are just bombed out everywhere, and it's like, how is this benefiting Syria? on this.
It's not, and what's amazing to it, again, you don't see this on any of the mainstream American channels, just like they never tell you who these so-called rebels are, that they're basically Al-Qaeda, is that when you see, and remember a few months ago, we kept hearing about Aleppo's being destroyed, the Russians are bombing Aleppo into powder. Oh, it's a horrible humanitarian nightmare. Why doesn't somebody do something? What do you see from Aleppo today? Nothing. Did you see the celebrations of Christmas in Aleppo this past December? No. Did you see the celebrations of Easter in Aleppo this month? No, you didn't see that either. You didn't see the people returning to their homes, trying to rebuild their lives. You know, we keep hearing about the refugee crisis. The Russians are using the refugee crisis to destabilize Europe. Well, what about when the Syrian government recovers territory and people return to their homes? They're not going to Germany. They're not going to Sweden. They're returning to their homes in Syria. Isn't that what we want? Evidently not, because we're still sanctioning Syria. We're still trying to starve them out in the areas of Syria that are under government control. How is that a commitment to the Syrian people or rebuilding Syria? We also hear all the time from the usual suspects in the establishment that this is a sectarian war, that the Alawite-dominated regime is persecuting the Sunnis, who are a majority in Syria. And in fact, you'll hear some of the people saying this is not only an Arab NATO we're building, it's a Sunni NATO. We really need to build up a Sunni force and a Sunni state as a third force inside Syria. Nobody ever tells you that from the Syrian point of view, because the Syrian government is a secular government, it's not a sectarian war at all. Most of the soldiers in the Syrian army are Sunnis. The generals are mostly Sunnis. The cabinet ministers are mostly Sunnis. Their diplomats are mostly Sunnis. The first lady, Asma al-Assad, is a Sunni. The idea that of a sectarian war is coming from our side, from the Saudi side, who want to impose a Wahhabist sectarian Sharia state on the Syrian people, including a lot of Sunni Muslims who don't want one, who would rather live in a secular state, as well as on the Shiite, the Alawites, and especially the Christians, who will suffer the fate of the Christians in Iraq after the so-called liberation of that country, where 2/3 of them were rapidly driven out of the country.
Yeah, so it's like we have a thing where we have these stated goals don't match up with reality. The results of what they're trying to do is actually the opposite. And I'm wondering, is that really the goals? I mean, if you look at Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, they're in a terrible state compared to where they were, even with Saddam in charge. In Libya, obviously, there are so many things that are terrible there now: slavery, open slavery, etc. I almost think that there's almost like some kind of and let's just say like a satanic thing behind it, under the dressing that they tell you about to achieve these actual results. I mean, I don't know.
And look, there are theories like there's who is it? I think Pepe Escobar likes to write about the empire of chaos. The idea that somehow by sowing more chaos around the world, causing more misery, more destruction, more discord, that somehow allows us to be king of the hill. That everybody else is a mess, then we're in a stronger position. Maybe there are people that think along those lines. I think we also have the problem that not only do you have the establishment here and in our allied countries, I really call them satellite countries, who have their own way of doing things, their own agenda that their careers and their wealth are built on. You also have the problem that foreign states in the Middle East, obviously Israel and Saudi Arabia, have their agendas, and their agenda is Iran. Iran is the bad guy. We got to take care of Iran. And Syria, to a very greatest extent, is simply a theater in that war. That we have two countries that are very influential in the United States that have got a vendetta against Iran. Iran is the great Satan. They call us the great Satan. So we're involved. And then the obvious question comes up is, well, why do we have a dog in that fight? Are we located anywhere near the Middle East? If the Israelis or the Saudis got a beef with the Iranians, why is that our problem? Well, somehow it is, and we get involved. You'll hear from people, well, what is our interest in Syria? And they say, well, Iranian influence is a threat to Israel. It's a threat to our Arab allies. Well, isn't that their lookout? Why is that a problem for us?
I mean, is Iran really that bad? I mean, when I look at it, again, I'm not into this. I'm not an expert. But to me, is Iran really that much of a danger?
Well, to us, no, certainly not. And as far as Saudi Arabia and Israel go, look, Israel's sitting on top of a very hefty nuclear arsenal. I think they're probably in a position to make sure that they're not trifled with. As far as the Saudis go, look, if you want the number one supporter of terrorism around the world, it is in Iran by a long shot. It's Saudi Arabia. Remember, when we look at Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and all these groups in other countries, they're all Sunni Wahhabist ideology groups. They're not Shiites. How many Shiite terrorist attacks have there been in Europe or in the United States? All of the jihad attacks we've seen in these places are coming from people who are ideologically inspired by ISIS or Al Qaeda or various groups that have a Sunni ideology, not a Shiite ideology. So how the Iranians are a threat to us, I really don't see. Now, are they a regional adversary of countries that we have a strong relationship with? Yes. Why is it our problem, though, to get involved in their local quarrels that have nothing to do with us? Look, in 1977, I guess it was, maybe it was 78, Jimmy Carter declared that the Persian Gulf was a vital strategic interest of the United States, and he was declaring that specifically with respect to the Soviet Union, that we did not want Soviet influence in the Persian Gulf, because after the oil shock of 1973, we had to think about the Persian Gulf and Middle East oil as essential to our national well-being. Well, that isn't the case anymore. We're now a net exporter. We don't need Central Persian Gulf oil. The Middle East doesn't have that kind of national security significance to us. So why are we the ones who have to be everybody's sucker to get involved in these conflicts?
Well, the short answer I come up with is that we like to blow things up. And again, you're using the term we, meaning they, whatever, yeah. Like to blow things up. Oh, we got an excuse to throw off some candles. And, of course, they have to be replaced. So then they have to buy some more. So you have this. It's really sickening. It's really sick, if you ask me. But I can't think of a better answer.
No, I can't. And now the other thing too, and this I think relates to the Russians, and it's even bigger than Russians. It involves the Chinese. Also involves countries like I think Poland and Hungary and others in Eastern Europe primarily, but also movements like you see populist movements in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, the National Front in France. Is that you hear a lot about what we're doing is, we're not even pursuing economic or geostrategic interests. We're standing up for democracy and human rights. It's all about our values. Now, how our values have anything in common with those of Saudi Arabia is a whole other question. Well, let's put that aside for now. But I think there's a notion that we are now the guarantor, the vanguard of all progressive values when it comes to human rights and gay rights and all these wonderful things that the United States and Europe are the tutor for the rest of the world. So when Russia is a country that's increasingly rediscovering its Christian roots, in the case of Russia, Orthodox roots after the end of communism, or you have Poland being a much more conservative and Catholic country and in Dutch with the European Union because they don't want to take in a bunch of Muslim migrants. Hungary, Viktor Orban in Hungary has the same problem with the EU. You have a revival of Confucian ethos in China after many years in which the communists persecuted Confucianism, but the Chinese have enshrined it now as essentially their national philosophy. That I think what we don't want to respect in other countries is a notion they don't want to be necessarily like us. They don't want to be like Holland or Sweden. A few years Sweden won't be Sweden anymore either, the way they're going. They want to hearken back to the roots and the bedrock of their country and the standards and principles and traditions that their ancestors lived by for centuries. Why is that wrong? Why is that something we need to object to? Why do we carry on these so-called democracy activities all around the world, usually cheek by jowl, by the way, with George Soros and his money, to try to impose these postmodern, if I can say the word, godless, liberal values on people who simply do not want them? I think, unfortunately, there is an ideological component to what we do around the world, despite the election of Donald Trump, who to some extent I think reflected an American revulsion against that sort of thing. we really haven't seen any change in American policy. It's still strongly ensconced at the State Department. You see it in the activities of the National Endowment for Democracy, the Republican and Democratic International Institutes. And as I say, they essentially act as magnifiers for George Soros's money. In many cases, especially in Eastern Europe, we see the U.S. Embassy almost works as a branch office for the Open Society Institute. And it's a scandal. It really is.
It's almost like we're watching a movie. You know, like he's the James Bond villain or what have you and so on, and that there's people inside the United States government that is on his payroll looking for his agenda. I mean, it seems like we're actually living in a movie. I mean, if you can look forward ahead, I mean, where would you like to see? Let's say realistic. What would you like to see? And what are you afraid is actually going to be? I mean, you know, kind of those two sides.
What I'd like to see, of course, is for Trump to wake up one morning, realize he's president of the United States, fire all the bad people, saying, I'm going to do exactly everything I said during the campaign. I'm going to meet with Vladimir Putin in, Reykjavik next week. We're going to sort out this whole Syria thing. We're going to get disinvolved in the Ukraine situation. No more NATO expansion. Then maybe they should have a tripartite summit with President Xi of China. Come up with a concept of where the different spheres of influences are. I think that would also, alleviate our trade disputes, which I think are quite realistic with the Chinese. I'm all for Trump threatening the Chinese with tariffs where they are reasonable to rebalance our trade relationship with China and with other countries. But I think the natural trade-off of that is that when it comes to the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea, what part of South China Sea do we not understand? That our interests in the South China Sea are about as great as Chinese interests in the Gulf of Mexico. Zero. So if the offer to the Chinese is that, yeah, we want to have our trade relationship rebalanced, but we'll get out of your hair in your neighborhood, I think we should be able to work out something like that. Maybe we can, but I think it's worth a try. That's what I would like to see. What I'm afraid we're going to see is, in the worst possible circumstance, honestly, is that Trump gets removed. I really do think there's a danger here. We saw, again, the strike coincided with the raid on Michael Cohen's office and home. Some people even likened what Trump did in Syria to what Bill Clinton did in the Balkans during the Lewinsky scandal. Is he trying to shield himself from his vulnerable position domestically? I think there is an aspect of that. I think he could be in very big trouble if if the Democrats take the House in November, and I think the conventional wisdom is they very well could. I have no doubt if the Democrats take the House, Trump will be impeached, and if he is impeached, I have no doubt he will be removed. That even if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, there is a certain percentage of Republicans in the Senate, whether it's a quarter or a third or a half, but a certain substantial percentage that would welcome the opportunity to get him out of office and put a more conventional Republican like Mike Pence in, who seems like a perfectly nice fellow, but I think would be terribly ineffective as president and certainly would not do anything along Trump's populist course with regard to immigration, trade, or foreign policy, which to my mind were the three departures from Republican orthodoxy that got him elected in a way that a Mitt Romney or a John McCain could not get elected. That's my biggest fear. Even if he stays in office, though, I think there's the fear that the noose is still tightening around him. His freedom of action is much reduced, and all he can really do is try to do less than what all the deep staters around him want him to do. We won't really destroy all of Syria. We'll just have a couple more demonstrative strikes. We'll give lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, but we'll make them put them in a warehouse in West Ukraine and not anywhere near where the confrontation line is with the Donbass. I think you only get so far with that. Meanwhile, I do fear that the war clouds will continue to build.
Well, it seems that way. And one thing that I'm hoping on as far as Trump goes is there seems to be going forward. The Congress is now calling for a criminal investigation of Comey and Hillary, I believe, and others. And it seems like perhaps that'll go forward. Giuliani has joined the legal team, and he is claiming that 1 to 2 weeks they'll end this whole Mueller thing. I mean, there's this on the side, and I'm always worried about if they start to lose, that something will happen, some kind of a false flag thing or whatever, the Syrian, something will happen to try and derail that. But let's just hope that somehow there's a third scenario and we all go skipping, holding hands and flowers and singing Kumbaya.
Well, I think you're right, by the way, to link exactly what you said with the thing I said earlier, because I think the trumped up, if you pardon the expression, deep state effort to undermine the president, to reverse the results of the last election, are intimately connected with this whole, I would say, hijacking of his foreign policy agenda and putting in people who want to basically keep us in the third George W. Bush administration. If somehow, frankly, I think it would take a miracle if somehow this entire conspiracy were exposed, if John Brennan and James Clapper and Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe and all the rest of them did the perp walk. I think that would be a great thing if that whole conspiracy would lay bare for everyone to see. But, look, James, it makes you wonder, do we have the rule of law anymore in this country? I heard one person discussing on one of the news media how great it was that and somebody sympathetic to Trump, how great it was that the DNC was suing the Trump campaign, the Russian government, and who was the third one they were suing? Oh, WikiLeaks, because that will force them to hand over discovery about the DNC server and evidence was really hacked by the Russians, rather than that the material was leaked. So this could really be a vulnerability for the Democrats when the counterclaims come in from the other side. And my first thought of that was, yeah, if we still have the rule of law in this country, but how have the federal judges treated every other claim that has involved the Trump administration? Well, he issued an executive order that on face is personally legal, perfectly legal. Yeah, but I think there might be something racist about it. I'm going to hand down an injunction blocking it until I'm happy with it. These judges act like they're little tin gods, and I'm afraid that's what we will see on these things. What was the most recent? Oh, the thing with who is it, Judge Kimba Woods, about Michael Cohen's papers, about which way to rule on that, about outing Sean Hannity, who I've got my disagreements with, but nonetheless outing him as a client. I don't think they can get a fair shake from the courts, and even if the law and justice would require the Democrats to show their dirty laundry in the course of the discovery, I suspect it won't happen, because I think the courts, unfortunately, are at least as corrupt and maybe even more corrupt than most of the structures of our legal and political system.
Well, it seems like the court is the end run about doing things the hard way. And so if you can, no matter what the law says, if you get the courts to rule in your favor, well, then that's fine. And just hoping that there's enough judges left who has some kind of idea for the law. And then, of course, the constitutional aspects of it, the Supreme Court. But it seems like that by the time this is all going to get fixed, he'll be out of office. So
It's entirely possible, and like I say, James, I don't know how it all works. I mean, like a lot of Americans, first off, I'd love to see the Constitution observed. I remember the late Joe Soberin once said, the nice thing about our Constitution is that it presents no obstacle to our current form of government. Is that the political authorities do what they please. The presidents make war whenever they please, notwithstanding any authorization from Congress. The courts block whatever they want. The Supreme Court invents new rights that are nowhere in the Constitution. The bureaucrats make laws with the authority that belongs to Congress, but nowhere in the Constitution is delegated to bureaucrats. It's very hard to say we exist under the Constitution and under the rule of law anymore.
Yeah, well, that's true. But what I do appreciate is you taking the time to talk with us about this and get your insight on it, because, again, you're looking at things very grounded. You have the information and years of studying in the area. You're not putting out a political agenda. You're putting out a constitutionally sound moral agenda, and I do appreciate your insight on that. And we'll be checking back with you again, provided we can, if there's still a planet and stuff like that.
Provided we don't get dragged off to wherever they're holding Tucker Carlson these days for his heresies on Syria.
Yeah, well, okay. I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have Jim Jatras. I've got information down below how you can get in touch with him, his articles and whatnot. And we will look forward to having him talk with us in the future about things, and perhaps, hopefully, we'll be able to talk more positive. But anyway, thank you very much.